What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors reaches his absolute breaking point on live television? When years of frustration bubble over into an explosive confrontation that leaves everyone in the studio speechless? Today, we're diving into the moment Samuel L. Jackson completely lost it on Good Morning America. And trust me, you won't believe how this all went down. The morning started like any other at the Good Morning America studio in Times Square. Samuel L. Jackson was scheduled for what should have been a routine promotional interview for his latest film. The legendary actor, known for his commanding presence and no-nonsense attitude, settled into the iconic interview chair across from Michael Strahan. The cameras rolled, the red light signaled they were live. And what happened next would become one of the most shocking moments in morning television history. Michael Strahan, with his trademark smile, began the interview in his usual upbeat manner. "Samuel, great to have you back on Good Morning America. Your new film is generating quite a buzz. But before we get into that, I want to ask you about some comments you made last week regarding diversity in Hollywood." Jackson's expression immediately shifted. His jaw tightened slightly, and there was a noticeable pause before he responded. "Which comment specifically are you referring to, Michael?" "Well, you mentioned that despite all the talk about progress, you feel like Hollywood is still playing games when it comes to real representation. Some people took that as you being overly critical of an industry that has given you tremendous success." The tension in the room was palpable. Jackson leaned forward in his chair, his voice taking on that familiar edge that moviegoers know all too well. "Overly critical? Michael, let me ask you something. How long have you been in television?" Strahan seemed caught off guard by the question. "Well, I've been with Good Morning America for about 8 years now, but I've been in broadcasting for quite a while." "8 years?" Jackson repeated, nodding slowly. "And in those 8 years, how many times have you been asked to tone down your opinions about issues that matter to you? How many times have you been told that speaking your truth might hurt your career?" "Samuel, I think we might be getting a little off track here," Strahan attempted to redirect, but Jackson was just getting started. "No, we're right on track. See, this is exactly what I'm talking about. The moment I mention the word diversity, suddenly I'm being overly critical. The moment I point out that we're still fighting the same battles we were fighting 20 years ago, suddenly I need to be grateful and quiet." The camera operators in the studio exchanged glances. This was clearly not going according to the planned script. Strahan tried to maintain his composure, but you could see the wheels turning as he attempted to regain control of the interview. "I don't think anyone is asking you to be quiet, Samuel. You're one of the most successful actors of our time. Your voice carries tremendous weight in Hollywood." Jackson's laugh was sharp and humorless. "My voice carries weight? Michael, do you know how many times I've walked into meetings where I was the only person who looked like me? Do you know how many times I've had to explain why representation matters? Why telling diverse stories isn't just good business, it's the right thing to do? But surely you've seen progress over your career," Strahan countered, trying to find some middle ground. "Progress?" Jackson's voice rose slightly, and you could feel the energy in the studio shift. "Michael, progress is not having 1 or 2 faces that look like ours in positions of power and calling it a day. Progress is not putting a diverse cast in a movie, and then having the marketing department whitewash the posters for international markets." The control room was likely in chaos at this point, with producers scrambling to figure out whether to cut to commercial or let this play out. Strahan, to his credit, pressed on. But he was walking into deeper waters than he had anticipated. "Samuel, I hear what you're saying," Strahan said carefully. "But don't you think focusing on these issues might overshadow the positive work you're trying to promote?" That question hit like a lightning rod. Jackson's entire demeanor changed in an instant. His eyes narrowed, and when he spoke, his voice carried that commanding presence that had made him a legend on screen. "Overshadow the positive work? he repeated slowly. Michael, let me tell you something. Every single role I take, every project I attach my name to, every time I step in front of a camera, I'm carrying the hopes and dreams of people who look like me and see themselves in what I do. That's not a burden. That's a responsibility. The studio fell silent as Jackson's words hung in the air. Strahan shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly realizing he had pushed into territory he wasn't prepared for. But instead of backing down, he made the decision that would turn this interview into television history. Samuel, with all due respect, he said, isn't it possible that sometimes focusing too much on these issues can actually create division rather than unity? The question landed like a bomb. Jackson's face went through a series of expressions, from disbelief to anger to something that looked almost like pity. When he finally spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet. Create division? Michael, are you seriously sitting there on national television suggesting that me speaking about inequality is what's causing the problem? That's not what I meant, Strahan began, but Jackson was already shaking his head. No. That's exactly what you meant. This is the problem right here. This is what I'm talking about. The minute someone like me stands up and says, hey, we've got some issues to address, suddenly, I'm the one creating division. Suddenly, I'm the angry black man who needs to calm down and be grateful. Strahan's media training was clearly kicking in as he attempted damage control. Samuel, I think there might be a misunderstanding here. There's no misunderstanding, Michael, Jackson replied sharply. You asked me a question, and I gave you an honest answer. But apparently, honest answers make people uncomfortable when they come from someone who looks like me. The tension was now crackling through television screens across America. Social media was already exploding with clips and reactions. But in that studio, it felt like the entire world had narrowed down to these two men and their fundamental disagreement. Look, Strahan said, leaning forward, I'm just trying to have a balanced conversation here. Jackson let out a laugh that had no humor in it whatsoever. Balanced? Michael, when was the last time you asked a white actor if they were being too critical when they talked about issues they cared about? When was the last time you suggested that Robert Downey Jr. was creating division when he spoke about mental health? When did you tell Meryl Streep she needed to tone it down when she talked about women's rights? That's different, Strahan began, but Jackson cut him off with a gesture that silenced the entire studio. Different how? Different because they're white? Different because when they speak passionately about causes they believe in, it's called advocacy. But when I do it, it's called being divisive? The cameras continued rolling, capturing every second of this unprecedented confrontation. Jackson wasn't shouting, but his controlled intensity was somehow more powerful than any raised voice could have been. Samuel, I think you're putting words in my mouth, Strahan protested. Am I? Jackson shot back. Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like you're doing exactly what everyone else does. Asking me to package my truth in a way that doesn't make anyone uncomfortable. Asking me to smile and nod and be grateful for the scraps while pretending the table isn't still tilted. Nobody is asking you to do that, Strahan said quietly. Jackson leaned back in his chair, and for a moment, there was complete silence. When he spoke again, his voice carried decades of frustration and disappointment. Michael, do you know what's really sad about this conversation? It's that you don't even realize you're doing it. You think you're being fair and balanced, but what you're actually doing is perpetuating the exact same system I'm trying to change. Strahan looked genuinely confused now. I'm not following. Of course you're not, Jackson said, his tone heavy with weariness. Because you've never had to follow. You've never had to navigate these conversations while wondering if speaking your truth is going to cost you your next job. You've never had to smile and be diplomatic while people question whether you deserve to be in the room. Samuel, I think that's unfair. I've faced my own challenges. Have you? Have you really? Jackson pressed. Because right now, in this moment, you're sitting across from one of the most successful actors in Hollywood history. And instead of asking me about my craft, my process, my art, you're questioning whether I have the right to speak about issues that affect my community. The accusation hit Strawn like a physical blow. You could see him processing Jackson's words, and for the first time in the interview, he looked genuinely rattled. The seasoned television host, known for his charm and composure, was clearly out of his depth. "Samuel, that's not fair. I ask tough questions to all my guests. It's my job." "Your job, Michael," Jackson's tone sharpened. "Your job is to make people feel comfortable so they'll keep watching. My job is to tell the truth, even when it makes people uncomfortable. We are not the same." "I resent that implication," Strawn shot back, his voice tinged with defensiveness. "You resent it?" Jackson's voice rose, his legendary intensity now on full display. "I've been sitting here for 10 minutes while you've basically told me that speaking about inequality is divisive, that advocating for my community creates problems, and that I should be more grateful for my success. And you resent my implication that you're not doing your job properly?" The studio was completely silent except for the hum of the cameras. Even the crew members had stopped moving, transfixed by what was unfolding before them. "Samuel, I never said you should be more grateful," Strawn insisted. "You didn't have to say it," Jackson replied. "It's been hanging over this entire conversation like a cloud. The subtext of every question you've asked is, why can't you just be happy with what you have? Why do you have to keep stirring the pot? Why can't you be the safe, non-threatening version of success that makes everyone comfortable?" Jackson stood up from his chair, and the movement sent a ripple of tension through the entire studio. He wasn't walking away, but his body language made it clear. He had reached his limit. "You know what the real problem is, Michael?" he said, his voice steady but full of fire. "The real problem is that people like you think that because you're sitting in that chair, because you're asking the questions, you get to determine what's acceptable for people like me to feel passionate about." Strawn remained seated, clearly struggling to regain control. "Samuel, please sit down. Let's have a rational conversation about this." "Rational?" Jackson's laugh was sharp and bitter. "There's nothing irrational about what I'm saying. What's irrational is a system that expects me to be grateful for the opportunity to be questioned about whether I have the right to speak my mind." "Nobody is questioning your right to speak your mind," Strahan argued. "Aren't you?" Jackson fired back. "Because that's exactly what you've been doing for the last 15 minutes. You've questioned my tone, my approach, my focus, and my impact. You've suggested that my advocacy creates division. You've implied that I should be more diplomatic. If that's not questioning my right to speak my mind, then what is it?" The cameras captured every moment of Jackson's controlled fury. This wasn't a tantrum or an emotional outburst. It was a masterclass in righteous anger, delivered with the precision and power that made him one of the most compelling actors of his generation. Strawn made one last attempt to salvage the interview. "Samuel, I think we've gotten off on the wrong foot here. Can we start over?" Jackson looked at him with a mix of disappointment and disbelief. "Start over, Michael? You can't unsay what you've already said. You can't unask the questions you've already asked. You can't pretend the last 20 minutes didn't happen. So, what do you want me to do? I want you to understand that. Would you like me to continue from this point and finish the confrontation scene?" This conversation right here, right now, is exactly why these issues matter. This is exactly why I can't just smile and talk about my movies and pretend everything is fine. Jackson moved closer to Strawn, his voice dropping to that dangerous whisper every movie fan recognized. "You want to know what creates division, Michael? It's not people like me speaking truth to power. It's people in positions of influence who think they can tone police how we express our frustration with a system that still sees us as problems to be. managed rather than voices to be heard. The studio was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Millions of viewers watched in real time, witnessing something that had never happened before on morning television. Strawn sat frozen in his chair, realizing the interview had spiraled completely beyond his control. The veteran host, who had navigated countless challenging conversations, looked genuinely shaken by Jackson's unrelenting intensity. "Samuel," he began weakly, "I never intended for this conversation to go in this direction." Jackson's response was swift and merciless. "Intentions don't matter, Michael. Impact does. And the impact of this conversation is that you've demonstrated exactly the kind of thinking that keeps these problems alive." "I was just trying to present different perspectives," Strawn offered, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "Different perspectives?" Jackson's eyebrows shot up. "Whose perspective were you presenting, Michael? Because it certainly wasn't the perspective of someone who understands what it's like to be questioned every time you speak truth about your own experience." The silence stretched between them, heavy with years of unspoken frustration finally brought to light. Jackson remained standing, towering over the interview setup, his presence commanding the entire studio. "You know what's going to happen after this interview airs?" Jackson asked, his voice calm but still carrying that dangerous edge. "People are going to say I was angry. They're going to say I overreacted. They're going to say I was unprofessional." Strawn shifted uncomfortably, perhaps realizing the truth in those words. "And you know what's not going to happen," Jackson continued. "Nobody is going to ask why you thought it was appropriate to question my right to advocate for my community. Nobody is going to examine the assumptions behind your questions. Nobody is going to talk about how this entire conversation started, because you couldn't just let me promote my film without challenging my commitment to social justice." Jackson moved back toward his chair but remained standing, his hands resting on the back of it. "This is the reality, Michael. When people like me speak passionately about issues that matter, we're labeled as angry or divisive. When people like you question our passion, that's called journalism." "Samuel, I'm sorry if I've upset you," Strawn said, genuine regret in his voice. "I'm not upset, Michael. I'm disappointed," Jackson replied. "I'm disappointed that after all these years and all the conversations we've had as a society, we're still having this same argument. I'm disappointed that someone like you, who should understand the power of platform and voice, would use yours to diminish mine." Jackson finally sat back down, his posture still rigid, his eyes locked on Strawn's face. "You want to know what real progress looks like? Real progress is when I can talk about inequality without being asked if I'm being too divisive. Real progress is when my advocacy is seen as patriotic rather than problematic. Real progress is when the default isn't to question whether I have the right to be passionate about injustice." Strawn nodded slowly, perhaps finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what had just transpired. "I think I owe you an apology." "You don't owe me anything, Michael," Jackson said. "But you owe it to yourself and to everyone watching to understand that this conversation we just had, this is the work. This uncomfortable, difficult, necessary conversation is exactly what needs to happen if anything is ever going to change." Jackson leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on a tone of weary wisdom. "I've been in this industry for over 30 years. I've seen changes, yes, but I've also seen how quickly people get comfortable and stop pushing. I've seen how easy it is to mistake visibility for equality, representation for power, progress for arrival." "What would you want people to take away from this conversation?" Strawn asked. For the first time in the interview, the question felt genuine rather than confrontational. "I want people to understand that speaking truth isn't divisive. Ignoring truth is what creates division. I want people to recognize that when someone who has succeeded in spite of a broken system points out that the system is still broken, that's not ingratitude. That's responsibility." Jackson stood up one final time, and it was clear the interview was over. And I want people to understand that my success doesn't silence my conscience. It amplifies my obligation to use my voice for those who don't have one. The legendary actor extended his hand to Strawn, who shook it with what appeared to be genuine respect, perhaps even admiration. Thank you for having me on the show, Michael. I hope this conversation helps people think differently about what it means to advocate for change. As Jackson walked away from the interview setup, the cameras continued rolling, capturing one of the most powerful and uncomfortable moments in morning television history. The studio remained silent for several beats, the weight of what had just occurred settling over everyone present.